All right, hi everyone. This is chapter 5 video, and it begins here exactly on page 100. And it's all about building a paper, refining, and we're going to start with introduction and conclusion, just kind of reviewing some of these tips we've talked about throughout this class, and also some of the strategies you've learned in previous classes as well. All right, so now that you've written a couple of drafts, your goal is to make sure you present your ideas so that they're clear to the reader. Your job is to create a reader-friendly paper that smoothly guides the reader from one idea to the next. And this is one of the things we talked about with the organic essay. Um, as we write longer and longer essays, topic sentences won't be as important or necessary. But anytime we're doing kind of like a 5-paragraph academic essay, it does make a little more sense to have clear topic sentences. To do this, you'll need to read through your sentences one by one, thinking about your reader, considering how well you present your sentences. To help you identify strengths and weaknesses, it's important and useful to communicate directly with your reader. Your readers for this paper, or any paper you write for any English class, is going to be your teacher and also your classmates. So at least your peers. To refine your paper, you will add some finishing touches to your introduction, conclusion, and the language you use to link ideas clearly. If you remember, we talked about how at this level, we're not really focused on the grammar aspect of writing anymore. It's really more about the what we call syntax, putting together ideas, words into sentences that provide clear, effective communication to your readers. You will also formally document your evidence. So that's something we've been doing already throughout this quarter. Based on your readers' comments and your own editing, you can polish your paper so it's cohesive and rich in detail. And of course, that is the goal of this class, to help get us ready for being a lot more independent in the way that we craft a draft and then refine it and turn in our final draft for class. Because as I mentioned, in the future, you'll have classes in which you do not have first draft or final draft versions, right? It's just a one assignment and you turn it in one time. So the first time you turn it in is already your final draft, right? So this is all about teaching ourselves the skills in order to create cohesion and development in our essays. Honestly, right, it's going to be less of the grammar. Of course, grammar is important, vocabulary is important, but this is something I talk about in 273 in this class. It's always going to be more important that your content is important. Think about your essay 3, essay 4, even essay 5. Yes, your English could be perfect, but if you don't answer the prompt, right, we talked about that, that gets you a 0. So it's always about the content. So in this chapter, we're going to practice revising introduction and conclusion, revising language for cohesion, and it's going to talk about documenting your evidence, but unfortunately, this book does not use MLA format. So we're going to skip a big chunk of chapter 5. Please refer to all the slides and everything we talked about in this class. We really want to stick with MLA format. This book, again, does not use MLA format. So please, ignore the book when it talks about documenting evidence. All right, writing introductions and conclusions. Because introductions and conclusions form the reader's first and last impression of your paper, they deserve special attention. Often in writing the body of the paper, the introduction and conclusion are hurriedly written and not very effective. Keep this in mind if this is you. If you find yourself writing just a very quick intro, very quick conclusion, that could also hurt your paper because those are already 2 paragraphs. So that adds up, right? That's a big chunk of your paper. And you got to make sure that it's all cohesive. Now's the time to revise these 2 sections with the reader in mind. Revising your introduction and the conclusion at the same time is a great idea so that you can ensure that the beginning and ending of your paper link together smoothly. And this is sometimes what we call a bookend, right? Maybe you mentioned something you already talked about in your introduction, mention it in your conclusion. And that's a very nice way to call back to your introduction and leaves your reader with a nice final thought. All right, elements of an effective introduction as you first contact with your reader. The introduction is an opportunity to engage your reader's interest and identify the purpose of your essay. Usually that will be your thesis statement. In effective introduction, you accomplish three things then. Number one, you're going to engage your reader and introduce your topic. Number two, establish your purpose. And then three, state your thesis. This is something I talked about for essay number 4, where we're introducing the topic. We're not introducing Harper Lee, the author. We're introducing the topic, the theme. And for us, it's going to be the theme of perspective. And then we don't want to try not to talk about the book too much yet. So an effective introduction is to introduce the theme of perspective first. Remember in class, I said, just maybe in general, like in our world, our society, then slowly transition to the book, then introduce the book, and then state your thesis. So here's an example of an effective introduction. I'm just going to read parts of it. Celebrating the Revolution, French citizens sent King Louis XVI to the guillotine. Every Halloween day in ancient Rome, the most evil criminals were executed at the city square. So what you can see here is it's giving a little bit of kind of historical context, historical background. Right? Then finally, we have this. While it's true that the death penalty has some negative points, it's still a powerful and useful tool. Therefore, so as to deter crime, to kind of like the opposite of encourage, to give fairness to victims and their families, and to punish inhumane criminals, our society should keep the death penalty. So you can see at the very bottom, we have our thesis, and it's actually an argumentative essay. And you can tell because of the word should, right? That's how you know, because now you're arguing, this person is arguing that we should keep the death penalty. But you see at the beginning, it wasn't about the death penalty yet. Not necessarily, right? I mean, yes, it was kind of about death, yes, the guillotine, but we were telling kind of like a background information here. So introduction to the topic. In the opening sentences, the writer engages the reader's curiosity by giving examples of public executions from 3 historical periods. From the first 3 sentences, we assume that the topic will be the death penalty, but wonder what the writer will say about it because the examples he gives are from such different situations. So this is, you're kind of pulling your reader in. You want to make your reader keep reading. Purpose. The the writer explains why the topic is important. He states capital punishment has been a useful and powerful tool to protect justice and deter crime. And so yeah, that's a purpose for having capital punishment. Then he goes on to describe some of the controversy over execution as a punishment and offers his opinion about it. Thus, in the middle part of the introduction, the writer tells us its purpose for writing to show that capital punishment is still a powerful and useful tool. Of course, we end with our thesis. The last sentence of the paragraph is the thesis statement, which commonly, not always, but most likely usually should appear at the conclusion of the introduction. All right, so then let's go into a couple of techniques engaging your reader. Right, so you may have learned this before, but usually this is called the hook, or it's also sometimes called the hook. And so we just have a couple techniques here for writing a hook. Something, think about when you go fishing, right? It's like your hook, you're hooking, then your readers are fish and you're trying to pull them in. I suppose at that point they have no choice, right? Because you already caught them with your hook. But yeah, if you have a very strong hook, then your fish will not escape, because sometimes that can happen too. Use a quotation or a surprising fact or statistic from your sources that relates to the focus of your topic. So for example, the introduction to a paper on male violence could provide statistics on the percentage of violent crimes committed by males. This is more useful for sort of like a research paper. And we talked about this during essay 3, but yeah, it is possible to use quotes and evidence in your introduction, but usually what we see is that the quotes and evidence that we use could have been better used or should have been used in a body paragraph, which is why this is something I didn't ask us to practice yet. But some of us saw this in the research articles that we were reading, right? So yeah, this is more useful for probably your future research papers. Number 2 here, describe a problem, dilemma, or controversy associated with your topic. For instance, the introduction to a paper on assisted suicide could discuss the dilemma, the problem of balancing the rights of individuals with the medical obligation of doctors. So you're just describing something, and usually what this comes back to is kind of making general statements about something. And that's what I usually say, right? Try to make general statements. What about perspective? Why is perspective important, in life, right? Not just in this book, in life. Tell a story. Now that's more like an anecdote. It says, see the introduction on page 103, but this is the next page. But yeah, we'll take a look at that. Relate a personal reason for your interest in the topic. For example, a paper about the changing status of women in business might begin with a story about the early career of a successful businesswoman. This example doesn't really explain the personal reason for the interest in the topic. This is actually using another example, right? Like a story about a person. So again, this is kind of like giving background context, example, actually kind of like the example we saw on the previous page, right? Just giving some stories, examples. Define a word that is central to your topic. Remember, we did this for essay number 1. We probably needed to introduce and define the term globalization. An argument paper on genetically modified food could begin with a brief definition of what genetically modified means, of course. We also kind of did this with our essay number 3. Can probably need to explain what bilingualism or multilingualism is. Make a historical comparison or contrast. That's what we saw on the previous page with the death penalty example. All right, so on the next page, yeah, this 103, we do have this personal experience kind of telling a story. Now, I don't recommend this, right? Because like we said, in academic writing, we want to move away from I statements. So I'll leave this on the screen. You can read through this, but it's going to be more important that you start avoiding, don't use I statements at this level and beyond. What I do like is that this person still included statistics in the middle here. So you might want to consider using the statistic is still fine, but maybe avoiding this anecdote, this personal experience story. Although, yes, it just kind of depends on the prompt. If the prompt is asking you about like maybe your life, your experience, and then combine that with a maybe like a argumentative opinion, right, paper, then I can see how an anecdote might be a good idea, right? So really, you have to think about what is my prompt? What is the assignment? Should I use personal experience depending on the language of the prompt? Establishing your purpose. Right? So after you've engaged, after the hook, your next job is to explain which aspect of the topic you'll write about. Obviously, in one paper, you cannot say everything there is to say about a subject. So it's here you identify what is important about your topic. Think about essay 4. Yes, perspective is a huge topic, right? So many different things you could talk about, but what about perspective, importance of perspective for children in order to grow and learn and mature? Or what about perspective in terms of progress in society? What about perspective in terms of empathy, emotional understanding of others? You can kind of narrow it down a little bit. You may raise a new issue about it that has not been considered before, provide a comprehensive definition, give a detailed history, argue for or against it, and so on. Again, this is where you tell the reader your purpose for writing your essay. And then stating your thesis, we've talked about that. So I think we have a good idea of that. So just to summarize what we talked about so far in this chapter, have a hook. So usually as some sort of general statement, providing information, or just talking about this topic in general, right? And then we slowly get to that establishing the purpose. Now we limit the topic. We're not talking about all bilingualism, maybe all perspective, and then we end with our thesis. So kind of like three parts of an introduction. And then we have another example here. I'll just leave it on the screen for you to take a look at. But again, this has a personal experience, kind of like an anecdote, right? Like I statements, which we're trying to avoid. All right. Then we can move on to the conclusion, elements of an effective conclusion. So far, I have seen pretty strong and decent introductions and conclusions. So this again, just to give us some closing tips and reminders how to write a more effective conclusion. And just as the introduction is your first opportunity to connect with your reader, so the conclusion just so the conclusion is an opportunity to guide your reader to the close of your research paper. A strongly written conclusion leaves your reader not only with a clear understanding of the central point in your paper, this is why teachers ask you to restate your thesis, but also with a final comment that provides an interesting closing thought. And this is why teachers ask you to make predictions, give suggestions, give advice. An effective conclusion has two parts. Number one, a final analysis of the main points of your paper. So yeah, this is not an exact restatement, but a new way of expressing your central ideas. So let me clarify. In 273, we practiced restating our thesis, if you remember, with just different words, right? Synonyms and different sentence order. As we mature our essay writing skills, it's not going to be an exact restatement, but another way of explaining our central thesis, right? So think about, think about essay 4. If you mentioned, let's see, for example, all right, like, oh, perspective was important in event 1, event 2, and event 3. Of course, when you get to the conclusion, it doesn't make a lot of sense to say that again, right? Oh yeah, perspective was important in event 1, 2, and 3. Your reader knows that. Your reader saw that in the introduction. Your reader read your entire essay. Your reader read your body paragraphs. So it doesn't make sense to just simply restate the thesis again. But when you get down to here, the main point, what was your central idea, was that perspective was important in those events because something, right? And that's probably what you can remind your readers of at the beginning of the conclusion. So in other words, it might be a good idea to restate the why, right? Because you've already answered why very clearly in your body paragraphs. And this is just a quick summary, like reminder why, right? Why was perspective important? For example, for essay 4. Okay, 2, an ending comment that inspires your reader to continue thinking about your topic. This introduction and conclusion are from a research paper about the effects of, guess what? Globalization. Yeah. So right here, what do we do when we have a problem? Do we leave it alone, try to solve it? Most people say that globalization creates more and more problems, such as increasing the gap between the rich and the poor. However, this difference between people who have a lot and those who only have a little is not the result of an intention to increase the income gap in the world. Instead, it's a result of how well the first world nations have been managing their economies. Yeah, so there's that. I'll just, you can pause it and read that. And the conclusion, a summary of the main points. So yes, globalization is essential for people in third world countries to rise from the present state of poverty. Because of globalization, more people than ever before have employment in meaningful jobs, and literacy at all levels is spreading throughout the world. Technology such as internet, cell phones, and chances to travel connects people in all countries and helps decrease the income gap between the haves and have-nots. And then here's our ending comment. I refer the reader back to the expression about teaching a man to fish. Globalization provides the necessary tools for the poor to eat for a lifetime. Yeah, so in this conclusion, the writer provided a final analysis of the main points. Notice that the analysis includes thesis ideas, but expresses them in a new way. Final sentence of the conclusion links back to a proverb mentioned in the intro. Strategy provides a clear connection between the intro and the conclusion, right? So again, we call that a bookend. So right here, right, there is an expression that says, if you give a man to fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach a man how to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. This illustrates how globalization is a positive force because 1, 2, and 3. So of course, in the Here in the conclusion, right, the author mentions the proverb again, talks about feeding a man for a lifetime. So some techniques for writing an ending comment: echo the approach. I'm going to say it again, right? Use an introduction using different wording. Use a quotation. End with a powerful fact or detail related to the topic of the paper. And recommend a course of action. So this is the give advice and suggestions, right? What should we do now? What should happen now? All right. We have some now you tries on the next couple pages. And I'm gonna go to page 109. Leave 109 on the screen here. Okay, so this is kind of just some reminders and some questions to think about when you revise your introduction and conclusion paragraphs. Then on the next page, 110, we have 5 techniques for building cohesion. So how do we make sure that our body paragraphs flow nicely, especially as we write longer and longer essays? So 5 techniques. Number 1, use guiding language. 2, create lexical meaning lexicon, vocabulary. So words, right? Synonyms, create lexical chains, words that are all kind of related to the same topic. 3, using pronouns clearly. 4, keeping your verb tense consistent. And 5, linking old and new information. So start with number 1, use guiding language. When you created your outline, wrote your first draft, you have to decide which ideas to include, right? And then we have to think about how to flow logically from one point to the next. This is really important right here. This organization may be clear to you, but not necessarily to your reader, because we know what we want to say, right? It's in our brains, it's in our minds, but maybe if it doesn't come out in the right order or, with the right order of information, especially, we can confuse our readers. So we're going to use guiding language, words, phrases, and sentences that clarify the connections. These are typically what we just call transition words, transition phrases. Okay. As you review these sentences, consider how they develop the central idea of the paragraph and whether it's easy for the reader to follow. In the following paragraph from an essay on standardized testing, the writer uses sentences to explain the reason, give evidence, provide examples, and present an alternative perspective. So let's take a look. Example on the next page, 111. It has been argued that standardized testing motivates students to work harder when students face the pressure of achieving a certain test score, they're forced to work hard, right, and so forth. So I'm going to leave this on the screen here, but I'm going to read the bolded parts. You can see like a when students face. So they place a great deal. However, right, so I have a contrast. In other words, so explaining something clearly, paraphrasing, right? And that's what we usually want to do after a quote. For example, providing evidence, example, they also, so another additional, such as, giving more examples, thus, more like a conclusion. And as you see on the left side of that, we have our topic sentence, explaining a reason, providing alternate perspective, explains the outside evidence, right? In other words, provides examples, provides additional idea, and summarize. So yes, usually, if you remember if you took 263 and then 273, we know that paragraphs are actually small essays. Because when we first started writing essays, we actually just took a single paragraph and then we expanded a paragraph, right, into a 5-paragraph essay. So the reverse is true. Paragraphs are kind of like mini essays in terms of the structure and organization. Right now we have just a couple of commonly used phrases. A phrase to signal an example, like for example, a general point such as, okay, so such as, but remember, such as is part of the sentence. Such as does not begin a new sentence. For example, begins a new sentence. For example, comma, they study patterns of test questions and methods for quickly finding answers. That's something I'm not really saying. So that, yeah, I think we know, but that's a good reminder. Phrases to signal an alternative perspective, so showing contrast. However, comma, new sentence. So you can see that right here, right? However, comma, new sentence. Although, blah, 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 comma, rest of the sentence. So remember, in terms of grammar, although begins a dependent clause, although students may feel that the test score is how others will judge their ability and they will work hard to achieve the highest score possible, comma, right? So this whole thing was a dependent clause, comma, independent clause. Under this pressure, they may work harder, right? There it is. And then we see a comma, but to connect two complete sentences, comma, fanboys, comma, but they don't work deeply. So yeah, of course, keep punctuation and grammar in mind still. All right, more phrases. So possible objections. Some might argue that opponents of this point might state that. Okay, so think about your counter argument paragraphs from 273. I'll just leave that on the screen there. You can take a look. Phrases to signal a discussion about the cause of something. All right, so if X happens, blah, 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 right? Therefore, comma, Y happens. So sorry, when we should be using by itself, right? When this happens, comma, this happens. Or this happens, therefore, this happens. As a result, right? Therefore, as a result, consequently, those would be similar synonyms. Phrases to signal an elaboration or interpretation of outside evidence. In other words, that is, right? Those are great ways to signal you're about to paraphrase. The author's point is that, right? Or what the author means is that. There's some examples. Take a look at those. The example sentences, I mean. Phrases to signal an elaboration of the point you are making with a slight shift in focus. So whenever you have this also, you're probably going to introduce another point. Yeah, I think, I've seen this in our essays. I think we know that. In addition, furthermore, right, those kind of transition words. Phrases to signal a summary, thus, comma, overall, in conclusion. The point or the issue or the problem is that, and then a sort of summary. Okay. On the next page, 113 here, I'll just leave that on the screen. I think, yeah, if you want to read this, that's okay. But we've covered the point of these three paragraphs, right, is that we don't want to not. Okay, wait, that was a double negative. We want to have these transitions, right, so that we have cohesion. Because right here in the middle, you can see that if we don't have enough of these, right, it's not going to flow too well. However, if you have too many, but without, right, enough details, it'll just feel really choppy. Okay, so what this, again, in other words, an overuse of transition signals, right? Just a bunch of therefore, in addition, blah, 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 right? All these transitions. But if you don't have enough content, lack of details, then it just sounds like a bunch of transition words. Sometimes you can have a guiding sentence within a paragraph. So what this is telling us is that usually we have one paragraph with one topic and then another paragraph with another topic. This is a more advanced technique you can start challenging yourself, try to use, is you start transition to your next body paragraph topic at the end of the first body paragraph. Right? And that's what we see here. In other words, usually you have your introductory, kind of like a topic sentence, right, at the beginning of your second body paragraph. You can just maybe move that to the end of the first body paragraph if you want to try this. All right, so guiding sentences between paragraphs, you can see here, basically, heroes live for ideals and their principles function as a catalyst that motivates society. However, sometimes the hero's ideas conflict with some members of society. So that's the next topic, right, at the end of this paragraph. And then we have a new paragraph. Because heroes must often face some opposition to their ideals in their effort to change society, comma, they must also be brave, a second characteristic of heroes. So you notice we didn't necessarily lose the topic sentence of the next paragraph. We just started transitioning earlier, right? Transitioning the topic earlier. There's a now you try, and there's an example paragraph right here. Take a look at that. All right, the next strategy, create lexical chains. Repeating key words or related words can help emphasize important ideas. So I'll just put that right there. You can see it's just a bunch of synonyms, right? Or similar words and phrases. We have studying abroad, international, IES, study overseas, students, international, students in another country, host country. Yeah, this is all about, clearly it's all about international students. Yeah, so I think that makes sense. I'm not going to explain that one too much, but I'll go ahead and slowly go down. So if you want to pause, you can read these sections here. And then our third point is to use pronouns clearly. So yeah, we can use pronouns to replace nouns and proper nouns so that we don't have to keep saying them, of course. But we have to make sure we use the pronouns clearly, otherwise we might create some confusion. Right, compare the two examples of the use they. Example 1. The length of each stage of culture shock may vary from one person to another. They usually occur in the same order, however. Okay, so they referring to each stage, right? The stages of culture shock. So that's fine. Example 2. Students who study abroad state that their worldview has changed because of their interactions with people in their host culture. They also have a broader worldview through this interaction. Right, so right now the they, and if you think about grammar, this is what we call unclear pronoun, because you have people in their host culture, but the they seems like it's actually talking about students who study abroad. But remember, for grammar, a pronoun usually refers to the closest noun before, right? So this seems like it's referring to people in their host culture, and there's our problem. So be careful with your pronouns. Be careful with the word this, that, these, those, right? Because demonstratives, these are called demonstratives because we demonstrate. We use these words to point at something. Think about when you go to maybe like a cafe or a store, restaurant. You point at something like, oh, I want that one, that one. But the word that doesn't actually refer to anything in the language, in the sentences that you said. It actually refers to something in the real world. So just by reading, right, it's not going to tell you exactly what that refers to. For example, I could tell you right now, I want that. You have no idea what I'm talking about, right? But if I say, oh, world peace is great, I want that, right? Now that refers to world peace. So that's the point here, is be careful with these this or that words, because again, you as the writer, you know exactly what you mean, but sometimes your reader doesn't know because you didn't say what you mean yet. Keep in mind, your readers cannot read your mind. So make sure you communicate very, very clearly. And then here's an example of a demonstrative pronoun. This is referring to the student's new approach, right? And that paragraph will give you the example of that. On the next page, we have this demonstrative adjective plus catch-all. So these reasons. What this is saying is that you probably list a couple of reasons, and then these reasons right now, we're referring to all the things we talked about earlier. And then here are some words like approach, aspect, characteristic, circumstance, difficulty, factor, feature, issue, problem, reason, result, tendency. So these events, right? Think about SA4, these events, these interactions, these moments of growth. That's it. Okay, so pretty straightforward here with the pronoun. Next page, keeping verb tenses consistent. All right, so using using verb tenses clearly is important, of course, because if you are describing something, research, you have to let us know if this already happened, it's still happening, right? Like, is this already over? So number one, use simple present and simple past unless there's a clear reason to choose another verb tense. Remember, think about grammar, there are 12 verb forms. There's like progressive, ing, right? Like was going, is going, will be going. We really don't need to be using the ing. We usually don't need to use the progressive, perfect progressive, like has been going, will have been going. We usually don't need that either. Perfect tense probably sometimes is fine, right? Has been, has shown, has found. But more often than not, you'll probably be sticking to present tense and simple past. We use simple present, by the way, we use present tense usually when we describe literature, books and such, because these books and poems still exist right now. And then we can use simple past to describe, like research that was done in the past or something. But if it's a fact, if it's still true right now, then you'll want to use simple present. Provide a signal word or time phrase when switching between time frames, right? Otherwise, your reader might get pretty confused. So here's an example paragraph here with all the verbs in bold highlighted. So you can pause here and take a look at that example. And then finally, we want to link old and new information. In the structure of your paragraph, sentences work together to explain the idea. Central point is expanded in a second sentence, then go on, so forth, so forth. Basically right here is think about your previous sentence should kind of flow naturally into the next sentence. And the one thing I always recommend students is think about why. Always ask why or how at the end of each sentence, and then answer why or how in the next sentence. And that's how you guarantee, you promise, you make sure that you have cohesion in your body paragraphs. So always try to answer something about the previous sentence, right? Or kind of like give more information based on the previous sentence. So this is an example here. Culture shock and reverse culture shock have several stages in common. Okay, stages, right? What are the stages? So how, why, what? These shared stages include a honeymoon stage, a disintegration stage, and an adaptation stage. Okay, so what is this honeymoon stage? During the honeymoon period, students feel elated by the freshness of the culture. Why, right? Why or when or how did they feel elated? This excitement occurs whether a student is entering a new culture or returning to their home culture after a long absence. Oh, returning to their home culture? Is that what reverse culture shock is, right? So we have to explain that now. When students return home, their reaction to the familiar sights of their own culture can surprise them. Yeah, so we've done that very well, although we probably still need to explain disintegration and adaptation. So when you look at your sentences like this, making sure that each sentence is connected to the one before and after somehow, you're going to promise that you have very great cohesion. Linking old and new using passive voice. So this is another way. Think about active voice and passive voice in terms of grammar. Remember, active voice is you have the doer and then the action. Passive voice is the action and then the doer. Old information. One uncomfortable issue that students might come across from their study abroad experience is culture shock. All right, what is culture shock? Or talk more about it. Recognizing the stages of culture shock will not make it disappear, but like any problem, noticing it is the first step toward coping with it. Okay, so just like any problem, right? Culture shock seems to be a problem. Once the problem is understood, the student will feel less frustrated. Okay, how, why, when? Learning how to overcome a difficult experience is part of what a person can learn when he or she lives in a new culture. Experiencing a new culture is the best teacher for personal growth. So you can see a lot of this is just a little explaining kind of like why, how, why is that important, right? Why? So when I say why, always try to answer, well, why is that important? What else can you say about that sentence? So if you turn to page 122, we have some more bullet points as a reminder of how to revise our papers for cohesion. And you'll see from 123 to the end of the chapter, we have a lot of integrating and how to put evidence into to document your sources. But again, it's not in MLA format. So I think it's better to not mention these pages. Otherwise, it'll probably cause more confusion, if anything. But we're going to stick with MLA format. So of course, everything we've learned and talked about in this class in 2783 and before, we're going to use MLA format, of course. So basically, ignore page 123 to the end of chapter 5. And that does bring us to the end of chapter 5 then. So please go ahead and keep working on your essays, think about your introductions, conclusions, and kind of improving cohesion wherever possible. Because of course, at this point, vocabulary and grammar is going to be a little bit secondary to the content, the structure, and the organization, the flow or cohesion of your essays. All right, so that's pretty much it. Please take a look through this chapter, look at the activities, take a look at the answers provided on Canvas. Let me know if you have any questions, message me, email me, whatever it takes. And yeah, just let me know and I'll see you in class. All right, take care, everyone.